Okay, our second panel for this afternoon is on climate change and extreme weather events. And I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Don Boesch, if you want to just stand up, turn around very quickly. Don is on many environmental panels and expert panels and so forth, and was a key person in the governor's climate action plan. Dr. Mona Beckers, where'd she go?
Here.
Okay, yeah. All right, she's, again, the Department Chair for Environmental Studies here at McDaniel. And Dr. Mike Barber is coming down. Raise your hand, Mike. He works for Tetra Tech. And our final panelist, I know just a little bit about. He's actually my son, Eric. He's a College Park engineering major, interested in renewable energy and sustainability. Has been a shared passion for both of us. So we're going to start with Dr. Boesch. And if you have questions, once again at the end, we will pass them toward the center.
Great. You're going to advance for me. Okay, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here this morning in beautiful Carroll County. I have to tell you, though, I'm a little intimidated by Joseph, the student on the last panel. Not only because he was so articulate, but he basically said, forget the science stuff. That was so, like, before I was born, you know. It doesn't matter now. Well, I'm a scientist, so what am I going to say? Actually, when Mike Barber asked me to speak this morning, he asked me to kind of focus on the Bay, the Chesapeake Bay and Bay restoration, and not, and he's going to cover the climate issues. I couldn't come to Carroll County and not speak about climate change, though. So I'm going to say a little bit at the end, but I do want to kind of tell you where we are with respect to Chesapeake Bay restoration and what the challenges are that are meaningful and important for this region, for Carroll County specifically. So if we could take the next slide, please. The challenge with the Chesapeake Bay that we were slow to discover is that even though it is, when you look at it or on it, it is a very large body of water. Extends for almost 200 miles in length. But it actually is below the surface, quite shallow. It's got some deep spots, but its average depth is a little over 20 feet. And yet it drains this vast watershed of 64,000 square miles. And so what that means is that whatever happens in that watershed matters a lot to the bay, because it receives the runoff from that watershed, and it has only a limited capacity and volume to assimilate those materials that come off the watershed. Next, please. So here I go, science again. When scientists have done actually a remarkable amount of work on the Chesapeake Bay, figured out who killed Cock Robin, what happened to the bay, how did it change over time. And to make a long story short is that humans have been affecting the bay for a very long time, from Native Americans who are harvesting resources at small-scale effects. But even in the early days of colonial development, within our European colonial development of our watershed, we can go back in the history of the bay as deduced by cores of sediments that measure all kinds of things, the sedimentation rate, the changes in the chemistry, the changes in the biology of the bay are all kind of preserved in these sediments and pretty accurately reconstruct what went on. And with land clearing, the bay began to change quite dramatically, actually. And that's because it was this tremendously forested landscape. Forests can retain things and don't let much loose, nutrients or sediments loose. Of course, when we deforested, that changed and the bay began to change right away. We then went through early industrial development in the late 1800s. That is clearly chronicled in the bay. But the other thing that happened much more recently, far before Joseph was born, but really after I was born, really. In the 50s and 60s, the bay then really kicked over the edge, and its problems became far worse. Not just localized, like in Baltimore Harbor, we had some foul conditions, but the whole bay. And it was manifest in these two indicators, key indicators of the health of the bay and how it functions. The first slide will show you what's called hypoxia. This is what popular press calls the dead zone in the bay. This is the summertime conditions where deeper parts of the bay don't have much oxygen at all, too little to allow fish and crabs and so on to live there. And in some cases become completely devoid of oxygen and producing toxic as well as smelly hydrogen sulfide. And so you can see, even from the 50s to the 80s, this dramatic expansion of this extent of this dead zone in the bay. Next, please. And another important aspect of the bay's ecology is that the bay shorelines, the shallows, were once carpeted with very extensive grass beds. These are submerged grass beds that are tremendously productive and valuable as a food resource as well as a sheltered habitat for critters that we care about in the bay. And you see that, again, that same time period, that dramatic transition. In fact, in this case, this has been significantly reduced even beyond this. So we saw these warning signs. And next, please. And what it's basically due to, although there were some contests among scientists about what the causes were, it's now been very well established, and in fact established on a global scale, that similar things were happening around the world about the same time, is that it resulted from an infusion, because of human activities, of two things that are really essential for life, two elements, nitrogen and phosphorus. These are the things you would put on your garden, Drew's garden, even though you use organic, recycled compost, right? They contain nitrogen and phosphorus, though, and that's why they're put on the field in order to stimulate the growth. We wouldn't have DNA without phosphorus, and we wouldn't have protein in our bodies without nitrogen. So they're really incredibly important. The problem is that too much of a good thing. And if we get an excessive amount of this coming off of the landscape by our direct discharges or this runoff, it stimulates the growth of small plankton, which immediately begin to cloud the water and prevent light to penetrate. That wipes out these grasses that I told you about that live in the shallows. That changes the food chain. That material is produced and is not consumed and sinks to the bottom, depletes the oxygen. And it's a vicious cycle, because that whole process of when the oxygen becomes stressful, the system works so that it pumps back, recycles more nitrogen and phosphorus, making the engine burn faster, if you will. And so the real challenge we have if we're going to restore this. The other thing, of course, that happened is that even earlier we mined out most of this natural, wonderful filtering mechanism in the bay. The oysters, the organism the bay was named for, the great shellfish bay. And so that even made the problem worse, because the inability to kind of remove this excess production. So the challenge we have if we're going to restore the vitality of this wonderful ecosystem, which in many ways, Maryland defines who we are. It cuts right through our state. We have so much, even though if you don't live along the shore of the bay, every Marylander knows about the Chesapeake and feels a sense of pride about it, is how do we reduce those inputs to the point that we can have the system restored. It's not an easy issue, either scientifically or operationally, because what we've now learned is that these things, mention that feedback I told you about, they don't happen in just a literal fashion like you were, okay, we can turn that back and we're going to see immediate response. It's more like if you were taking chemistry in high school or college, when you do titrations, you get to a turning point, all of a sudden the phenolphthalein or the indicators switches. So we have to have these turning points and so on as we go along this rough ride and do it. So next, please. This is just to indicate the dramatic reduction. This is the oyster harvest. Estimated now, I said about 1%. Recent work by some of my colleagues indicate that it's about 0.3% of historic levels of oysters in the bay today. Next, please. So I'm going to show you a few of these little histograms, and I know it's kind of sciencey, but it's simple. It's just a little histogram. I think you can understand it. These represent where we think we were. This is nitrogen, one of the two important elements, in 1985, when we said we have a problem and that we need to do something about it. So the first commitment to begin to address this was actually in 1983. And in 1987, the 3 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government got actually pretty specific about it. It said we are committed to reducing the inputs, in this case nitrogen and also phosphorus, by 40% by the year 2000. Seemed like a simple thing to do at the time. It's about what we thought we would need to do. And it turned out to be much more challenging and difficult than we thought. Nonetheless, we're estimating that in 2009 and 2010, we're about here in those reductions. The best science we have is that to get to some sort of a, not a prehistoric Chesapeake Bay by any stretch of the imagination, something like what it was in the 60s and so on, we need to get here. If we wanted to get to the John Smith Chesapeake Bay, we'd have to get about here. Okay? And can't do that with the land uses and the number of people that we have. So this is the reasonable compromise that we think is achievable and will produce positive results scientifically. Okay, so what have we done and what do we know? One of the things, important things that we did is that this greenish area is wastewater. These are treated sewage waste for the most part. There's some industrial waste and so on. And we've actually been able to reduce those inputs quite significantly. We know this pretty precisely because you can measure concentrations at the end of the pipe. You know what you're doing, if you will. The other interesting thing is these top 2 elements here, which are actually come from atmospheric deposition. These are cost things. When we burn fossil fuels, we create, one could say that word, NOx, nitrogen oxides, that actually then come raining back down on the landscape and on the bay. That's additional source of nitrogen. Interestingly, even though initially this 1987 agreement that we said we would meet in 2000 said we can't do anything about atmospheric deposition. That's a whole other part of the law, and it's too problematic. We actually have measurable bona fide benefits as a result of our efforts to improve air quality. They weren't intended to restore the Chesapeake Bay. This is to produce, in this case, ozone and to deal with health problems related to humans and air quality. So we have a positive benefit there. The other thing, this other large part here is agriculture. And the point I want to make here is that this is what we think we've done, because as opposed to the other 2, we can't directly measure it very easily. There's no end of a pipe in agriculture. There's acres and acres of farm fields all over the watershed. And so based upon what practices we put in place, we basically estimated that this is accurate. It could be wrong as we get down the line. The other point I will point here is this yellow here and this little sliver here. This is urban runoff, and this is septic systems. So septic inputs are actually a quite small part of the equation, but the other interesting thing about these 2 is that these are the only 2 that were growing. Everything else was being reduced. These were growing during that time period. So now the focus on urban runoff and septic systems is as much as anything to prevent backsliding on the gain. So we're spending all this money getting farmers to do these things, and we're all paying for it. Why do that if you're making 1 step forward and 2 steps backward, by not dealing with the other growth sources of these inputs? So this is where we need to be, and so there's next, please. Just to very briefly show you another important dimension of this, and this is the distribution, same sort of data with the targets and so on that we'll have to achieve. in 2025. I should back up and say, remember I said the first goal was 2000? Guess what? We missed it. Missed it badly. We said, we're not going to do that again. 2010, we're going to have another goal. We're actually going to make it more scientifically rigorous. In fact, it's a little bit steeper goal. And, you know, we feel so strongly about this. We're going to, if we miss it in 2010, we will actually have to change the way we're doing this. So no longer voluntarism, a voluntary approach. We're going to have, in 2010, all of the states involved in this, and EPA agreed that if we missed it in 2010, we will then agree that EPA move forward with, under the law, the Clean Water Act, and something called a total maximum daily load, TMDLs, where EPA can say, you have to achieve these results, or what? Well, they can enforce action under the Clean Water Act. So right now, all this anxiety that we have, this new commitment, which now has teeth to it, ostensibly. Teeth, of course, depends on politics and the willing to bite, if you will. But presently, the EPA is standing strong on this. You know, what's happened here, now we're talking 20 years, in 1987, 2010, or 2012, and now the forces out there, local governments, no governments will be named, the American Farm Bureau Federation nationally, developers organization, they say, wait a minute, you're imposing this on us. We never agreed. Well, we did. And now we're dealing with the consequences of it. The other thing that they're attacking is the science behind this. Curiously, I always bragged about how good the science is. And science is embedded in the models that are used to make these projections. So, and actually the science that sets this goal, I think, is very robust, it's world class. The only uncertainties in the science are our estimations. They're giving us credit for things that we've done that we don't know that we've done. So that's kind of the challenge. But people want to stop the whole thing because of the science and the economic impacts and that sort of thing going forward. The other point I want to make is that here is, where are we? Maryland. So you see we're still a small, and we've made actually better strides than other states. So why us? Look at Pennsylvania and Virginia. Come on, guys. The problem is that we're in the middle of it. We have the most degraded part of the bay, and if we don't take the action, what are the chances that the other state? Pennsylvania doesn't even have a shoreline on the bay. You know, what are the incentives for it to do? So when you think about it and you drill down to say a county like Carroll County, we're such a small piece of the problem. What we do won't matter. Well, it won't matter in terms of the moles of nitrogen that much, but it will matter in terms of actually developing the political will that will make the whole thing happen across the entire watershed. Next. I won't go into much detail here. This is phosphorus, and the point here is that to make the goals, we've done this largely because of advanced waste treatment and sewage treatment. We now have to, we have a little bit more we can wring out of that, but we now have to work on agriculture and urban sources. This is stormwater management, because this is how phosphorus is delivered from urban runoff sources. Phosphorus tends to associate with particulate, like soil particles, sediment particles. And so if we are not controlling stormwater in a way that affects the movement of that sediment and stormwater, we're adding a lot of phosphorus. Next. Again, the same sort of thing that shows Maryland is a small part of the ultimate equation we have to meet, but we need to be the leader, not the laggard, in order to get, in this case, Virginia, which is an important source. Remember, Pennsylvania dominated nitrogen to be in the mix. One of the reasons Pennsylvania doesn't contribute more here is because of why? No, dams. A lot of the phosphorus, remember I said it's associated with particles, is trapped behind the dams in the Susquehanna, which are filling up. your concern is that whether there will be more phosphorus coming down from Pennsylvania. Next. So this is the process in which we've identified impaired water bodies. So this TMDL deals not only with the Chesapeake main stem itself, but there are many other water bodies, the Patapsco, others, which already are also impaired. So this grand solution has to meet those water quality standards for those water bodies as well as the main stem bay. Next. Oh, I'm sorry, back up just a bit. So we do this by developing these TMDLs based upon the science and the models. We're implementing management actions. That's what we're going through again here, monitoring progress and getting better and making sure we're achieving the goals as we go along. And so each state, and now on subunits of the state by watersheds and local jurisdictions, we're going through this progress of saying, now we need a credible plan. No longer trust us for 10 years. Oh, I forgot to tell you, the next goal, you think they missed it, give us 10 years. Next goal, we're giving ourselves 15 years. So here, 2025, if I'm still alive, subtract from that 1987 when we started. This is the period which we're trying to achieve this overall restoration. So there are a whole variety of, I won't read these, but wastewater treatment upgrades. This is the flush feed that Drew talked about, that we're in Maryland's approach using to try to address this and make sure that our sewage was adequately treated. We're working to retrofit septic systems as well as the controls on new septic systems that Drew talked about. A lot going on in agriculture, both with respect to animal waste as well as row crop culture. This is a picture of cover crops, which Maryland's been very aggressive in. This is after you harvest. If you have a fallow field during the fall and winter, that's the period where you have a lot of excess water draining through the soil and leaching the nitrogen into the groundwater where it's hard to control. This is a mechanism to keep it up near the surface, so you can use it next year for the crop, but also to keep it from contaminating the groundwater. Very effective, but very expensive strategy because we're paying farmers every year to do this. When we first briefed Governor O'Malley, when he started in his term, he scratched his head and he says, we're paying it, and we have to do this like forever? Well, it's another challenge. We have to find ways to work this in within their business model and make it acceptable, but also profitable, like we talked about before, because by doing this, they're actually adding quality to the soil, but also retaining fertilizers that they can use next year and have to use less. Stream restoration, all the like. Next, please. It's all subdivided, as I said, so we have targets for each of these watersheds and sub-watersheds, and within those, and I forget, Carroll County must have fallen, I think, at least 2 or maybe 3 of those units. There is a county-wide goal as well. The counties then have to develop their implementation plans. The one for agriculture is done on a statewide basis that has county specificity. So the counties are being asked to deal with their issues with respect to wastewater as well as urban stormwater, that sort of thing, moving forward. And have to develop credible plans. The other thing is no longer are we saying, give us 10 years and then come back and see how we've done. This is going to be judged with 2-year milestones. So every 2 years, you have to prepare a report to show how far you are and the strategy to help us to achieve the result. Next. This is Maryland's watershed improvement plan, aggregated for the whole state. So you see, this is where we think we are. Again, with the uncertainties about agriculture, it could be in here somewhere. This is where we are with wastewater and so on. So as you can see, we're going to continue with the investments that have just been approved by the General Assembly on the increase in the flush fee to make these investments and make these additional reductions for nitrogen in this case for wastewater. But it means that we really have to make sure that urban stormwater doesn't grow, in fact, begins to go down. So we're doing this through a variety of permits that the state, under the jurisdiction of the Federal Clean Water Act, issued to the local governments for stormwater management. And again, septic needs to not grow any longer, it needs to go down. Next, please. Some of my colleagues in the news just recently produced an annual report card that showed actually a decline in the health of the bay. Don't be, pardon?
D plus.
D plus. Don't be alarmed in that. It's not a pretty picture, because there's some there's some reasons because of the unusual nature of this year. All of those bar graphs that I showed you kind of assume a perfect world. Like every year is just like the other. We're normalizing over the fact that we have climatic variability that affect agricultural urban runoff particularly. It doesn't affect wastewater that much. And then we have a very wet year, like we had the wet spring of last year, followed by a hot and dry summer, which really has the right conditions to cook the algae to diminish the dead zone even more, and then followed by a late season hurricane that actually, kind of dumped more stuff into the bay from the runoff. This is the Lee, I guess it was. The second storm was the wet one, and then caused the bay to re-stratify the dead zone to reappear. All of those things made it a bad first year. So we have to kind of look at where we're going over the long run. How much do I have? 2 minutes. Okay. Next, please. Speaking of climate, this is kind of interesting. I told you that we didn't have to go fix the Chesapeake Bay. It came to us. Next, please. And I've had one of my other things that I do, other than work on bay issues, is on climate change on a national, international level. And I wanted to make this, just taking this from this recent report by the National Academy of Sciences, which I was a contributor to. And these were carefully argued words. Climate change is occurring. There's no doubt. It is caused largely by human activities. No doubt. It poses significant risk for, and in many cases are already affecting, a broad range of human and natural systems. These risks indicate a pressing need for substantial action to limit the magnitude of climate change and adapting to this impact. And I'm proud to say that Maryland is actually among the leading states trying to address the problem. Next. Skip this one. Too much science. So one of the things we did was to help us understand as Marylanders what it means to us. I mean, it's one thing to see these pictures of polar bears, grabbing onto the ice floe. It tugs at your heartstrings, but people want to know, how does it affect me and the things that I care about? This is from an assessment we did for the states for the Maryland Climate Action Plan, and to show you, based upon the best models and science that we had, where we are and the increase. This is in the average temperature in degrees Fahrenheit under low emissions assumptions. That is, our emissions will kind of stop growing and then level off and decline during this century, and it's sort of business as usual. And you can see there are significant consequences to us by taking action. This action has to be not just Maryland, just like Carroll County and the whole watershed. The United States has to be part of the solution, has to be the leader of the solution to make things happen. And you can see how this would play out over the state in terms of the summertime temperatures of 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. So what I tell people is that, the climate in Maryland will change so that in the winter we'd be more like Charleston, South Carolina. Hey, that's nice, I might retire there, Guess what though? The flip side of that, you get the summer, which is like Phoenix, with humidity. And this shows you, bring it closer to home, the predicted number of 90-degree days with a little bit more if you live in an urban environment, and 100-degree days. So the bottom line is that we'd be a rare day in the summer where the temperature didn't exceed 90, and we would have something like 3 weeks or more of days with exceeding 100 degrees. So this really is a big deal. And you can go on about the level of effects, but I just wanted to mention that climate change, because I'm in Carroll County, and then also hand it off to Mike. Thanks very much.